The NHRA banned a car worth $500,000, and the real reason why it is still officially secret to this day. Now, before you think you have heard this kind of story before, I want you to stop right there, because this is not your typical banned car story. This is not about a technicality. This is not about a builder who cut corners or tried to sneak something past the officials. This is about a machine that was completely 100% legal and got banned anyway. The car was Don Carlton's 1972 Dodge Demon, the same Mopar Missile that had embarrassed every Ford, every Chevy, and every rival on the pro stock circuit for 2 straight seasons. A car so dominant that it did not just win races, it made the rest of the field look like they were competing in a completely different sport. And the reason the NHRA eventually banned it is the part that should make every real racing fan genuinely angry. My name is David, and I have been covering drag racing history on this channel for a long time now. I have told you stories about controversial cars, controversial drivers, and controversial decisions. But when I first came across the full details of what happened to Don Carlton and that Dodge Demon, I sat back in my chair and just shook my head. Because what happened to this man and this machine is one of the most blatant examples of political interference in the history of American motorsport. A car that passed every single inspection, a builder who followed every single rule, a result that was decided not on the track but in a back office somewhere, buried inside a routine-looking technical bulletin that most people never even read. And somehow, for decades, almost nobody talked about it publicly. The trade magazines stayed quiet. The official record was sanitized. The story survived only in conversations between the people who had actually been there. So today, we are going to talk about it, all of it, from the very first bolt that went into that build, all the way to the day the Dodge Demon disappeared from competition forever. We are going to talk about the man behind it, the 426 Hemi engine that made NHRA officials visibly uncomfortable, the full teardown inspection that found absolutely nothing wrong, and the rulebook change that ended everything overnight. This is going to take a while, because this story deserves to be told properly. So get comfortable, because the next 25 minutes are going to change the way you look at the NHRA forever. To truly understand what happened to Don Carlton and the Mopar Missile, you have to go back, all the way back to 1971 and 1972. Because if you were not alive during that particular era of pro stock drag racing, it is almost impossible to describe what it felt like to be at one of those events. This was not the polished, corporate, television-friendly sport that exists today. This was something completely different. This was raw, unfiltered, American horsepower at its absolute peak, and the factory rivalry between Mopar, Ford, and General Motors on the pro stock circuit was unlike anything that has existed in motorsport before or since. These manufacturers were genuinely at war with each other. Every weekend, on strips across the country, their proxy armies lined up and settled arguments that no advertisement ever could. Chrysler had committed to racing in a way that General Motors and Ford simply hadn't matched at that level. The 426 Hemi was their weapon, a hand-assembled, racing-specific engine that had been purpose-built for one reason only, and that reason was winning. When it ran right, nothing touched it. It was not an engine that was easy to build correctly or easy to tune. It was demanding, temperamental, and unforgiving of mistakes. But in the hands of someone who truly understood it, who understood the physics of what was happening inside those hemispherical combustion chambers at 8,000 RPM, it produced power that was genuinely in a different category from anything else in pro stock competition. And in Don Carlton's hands, running out of the factory-supported Mopar Missile program, it ran right every single time he rolled to the line. Every single weekend, from the Pomona Fairplex in California all the way to Englishtown in New Jersey, drag strips were packed to capacity. We are talking about working-class Americans mechanics, factory workers, veterans, farmers' men who had spent their entire week turning wrenches or running equipment, and on Saturday morning they loaded up and drove to the track, not to watch a carefully produced show, not to be entertained in a passive sense, to witness something real, to see the Dodge against the Camaro, the Plymouth against the Mustang, and to feel the concussion of a properly tuned Hemi launching off the line at full throttle. The smell of nitromethane and hot rubber in the summer air. The sound that hits you in the chest before it ever reaches your ears. If you were there, in that era, at one of those strips, you never forget it for the rest of your life. The competition in those years was fierce in a way that is genuinely hard to explain to a younger generation. These were not factory-backed teams with unlimited budgets and large engineering departments. Most of the serious pro stock builders were working with small crews, limited resources, and the kind of knowledge that could only be accumulated through years of building, running, breaking, and rebuilding. Trial and error at a level that would seem almost insane by today's standards. And out of that environment came some of the most genuinely creative engine development the sport had ever seen, because when you are working at the edge of what is known, and when you have enough stubbornness to ignore what everyone else says cannot be done, sometimes you figure out something that changes everything. The man who would change everything was Don Carlton, and he was not a celebrity. He was not a household name, even in serious racing circles at the time. He did not have a shelf full of national championships or a face that people recognized from magazine covers. What he had was a small shop in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a level of mechanical intelligence that bordered on the obsessive, and approximately 15 years of accumulated knowledge about internal combustion engines that he had gathered one motor at a time. He had grown up around machines. His father was a mechanic. His uncle ran a small speed shop. From the time he was old enough to hold a wrench, he was a master mechanic. He was taking things apart to understand how they worked, and more importantly, to figure out how they could work better. By the time he joined the Mopar Missile program in the early 1970s, he had already built a quiet reputation in his regional racing community as someone whose engines always produced more than they had any right to. People brought him their motors when nobody else could figure out what was wrong. And more often than not, he found the problem not because he had better equipment than everyone else, but because he thought about mechanical problems in a fundamentally different way than most of his contemporaries. What separated Carlton from other pro stock engine builders of his era was a singular, almost consuming obsession with airflow. While most serious builders in the late 1960s and early 1970s were focused on displacement, bigger cubic inches, more fuel, more compression, Carlton was focused on something that most of his contemporaries gave only passing attention to. He wanted to understand exactly what was happening inside the 426 Hemi cylinder heads at the precise moment of intake, how the air and fuel mixture traveled from the carburetor, through the intake manifold, through the ports, and into the hemispherical combustion chamber. He believed, and he was completely correct, that most Hemi engines of that era were leaving a significant amount of power unrealized simply because the path that mixture traveled was inefficient, full of turbulence at the wrong moments, full of friction and energy loss that never showed up on a simple displacement calculation but absolutely showed up in elapsed times. He started doing hand calculations, pages and pages of them, filling notebooks with airflow mathematics that most of the people around him did not fully follow. He built test equipment in his Chattanooga shop to measure airflow through different port configurations on actual Hemi cylinder heads, not theoretical configurations, but physical shapes that he cut and reshaped by hand and then measured carefully. He experimented with port shapes, port angles, valve positioning, and the precise geometry of the transitions between different sections of the intake path. These were things that even Chrysler's own factory engineers were not paying systematic attention to at the level Carlton was working. And slowly, over a period of years, he developed an understanding of 426 Hemi airflow that was genuinely ahead of what anyone else in pro stock competition had achieved. The kind of understanding that today would earn a person a very comfortable living consulting for a professional racing program. Back then, it just made him an extraordinarily dangerous man to race against. When the Mopar Missile program gave him the full resources and the national platform to express everything he had learned about that engine, the result was the 1972 Dodge Demon. And building it the way Carlton built, it took the better part of 2 full years. Not because he was slow, but because he refused to move forward to any next step until the previous one was exactly right. Most builders at that level were driven by competitive urgency. They wanted to be running yesterday. Carlton was different. He understood, at a fundamental level, that one correctly built component was worth more than 10 rushed ones. And in drag racing, where races are decided by hundredths of a second, that philosophy is not patience for its own sake, it is a competitive strategy. The chassis was fabricated to his exact specifications by a custom shop he had worked with before and trusted completely. Every tube was chosen for the correct combination of strength and weight. The geometry was calculated carefully to maximize weight transfer off the line, because in pro stock drag racing, as every serious competitor knows, the launch is everything. A car that hooks up perfectly in the first 60 feet has already won half the race before it reaches second gear. He knew this. Every weld on that chassis reflected that knowledge. The body was stripped to the absolute minimum, no unnecessary panels, no decorative elements. Nothing that did not either serve a structural purpose or an aerodynamic one. People who saw the Demon in its early stages described it as looking almost aggressive in its simplicity, like a machine that had been reduced to only its essential purpose and nothing else. And then there was the 426 Hemi. The cylinder head work alone took Carlton 4 months. 4 months of hand porting carefully, methodically reshaping the intake and exhaust ports on those Hemi heads to the exact profiles his airflow, calculations told him, would produce the most efficient results at the RPM range he was targeting for pro stock competition. This was not aggressive porting in the traditional sense, removing as much material as possible to create the biggest possible opening. This was precision work, controlled reshaping to specific geometries that his flow testing had confirmed as optimal. The difference between what those ports looked like before he touched them and what they looked like after 4 months of his work was not dramatic to the untrained eye. But to the airflow that traveled through them, it was the difference between turbulence and laminar flow, between wasted energy and power delivered to the crankshaft. The camshaft was ground to a profile that Carlton had designed himself based entirely on his own engine modeling work. It was aggressive, significantly more aggressive than anything being used in production-based pro stock competition at the time. The duration and lift numbers would have raised eyebrows in any serious engine shop that saw them. But Carlton had done the mathematics. He knew exactly what compression ratio, what fuel mixture, and what operating temperature would allow that camshaft to produce power instead of simply destroying valve train components. When the Hemi was assembled for the first time and the Demon was fired up in his Chattanooga shop, the sound alone told everyone who was present that something genuinely unusual had been created. Not louder than a normal Hemi, different, cleaner, more purposeful. Like the engine had been resolved in a way that most racing engines simply are not. The first time Don Carlton's Dodge Demon made an official pass at an NHRA event, the timing crew ran the numbers twice, not because their equipment was malfunctioning, but because the elapsed time and the trap speed that came back simply did not seem possible for the class this car was running in. People in the bleachers went quiet for a brief moment before the reaction came, because there was that collective pause where everyone processed what they had just witnessed. The kind of silence that only happens when something truly unexpected occurs at a drag strip, where the crowd is loud and experienced and does not go quiet easily. Word traveled fast. In that era, information moved through the racing community through phone calls between track operators, conversations at speed shops, and word of mouth that spread with remarkable speed through tight-knit communities where everybody knew everybody. Within a month of that first event, the reputation of Carlton's Dodge Demon had spread well beyond the regional circuit it had started in. Competitors from across the country began making specific trips to events where the Mopar Missile was entered, some motivated by competitive pride and the need to be the one who finally beat it. Others simply needed to see for themselves whether what they had heard was actually real. It was real. The Demon won every event it entered during its competitive run with a consistency that had no precedent in that class at that time. Not all of the wins were close. Not all of them were dramatic finishes decided at the stripe. Some of them were simply over at the 60-foot mark, where the launch was so clean and the power delivery so immediate and so perfectly managed that the outcome was effectively clear before either car had reached the halfway point. Serious competitors, racers with excellent equipment, real experience, and well-prepared Camaros and Mustangs found themselves looking at scoreboards that their data could not explain. They had done everything right. Their setups were good. Their launches were clean. Their engines were healthy. And they had still been beaten by a margin that exceeded anything in their experience. The natural response was suspicion. When any car is that dominant in any form of motorsport, the default assumption is that something must be wrong, that somebody misrepresented a specification, slipped a component past the rulebook, or found a loophole that everyone else missed. That is human nature. It is also, in competitive racing, often the correct instinct because cheating exists, it has always existed, and the fastest cars are always the ones that attract the most scrutiny. That is not an unfair response. That is how a healthy competitive system is supposed to work. Scrutiny protects the sport. What made this situation genuinely unusual, and what made the suspicion increasingly difficult to maintain for anyone who looked at it, honestly, was Carlton's response to it. He did not resist inspection. He invited it. After every event where questions were raised, he opened the demon up completely. He pulled components himself, showed specifications, let officials measure whatever they wanted to measure, and answered every question that was put to him. He operated with a transparency that, in retrospect, reflected both supreme confidence in the legitimacy of his build and a deep philosophical commitment to honest competition. He had built something completely within the rules. He knew it beyond any doubt, and he was willing to prove it as many times as the process required. The problem was that the more times he proved it, the more uncomfortable the situation became for everyone around him. Because every inspection that came back clean was not simply a clearance for his car, it was a statement, a documented, official statement about the knowledge gap between Don Carlton and every other competitor in pro stock. It was evidence, accumulating event after event, that one man working in a relatively small shop in Chattanooga had figured out something about the 426 Hemi that an entire community of experienced, well-funded, factory-supported builders had not. And in a world where reputation and expertise are the currency that determines who gets the factory money, the sponsor deals, and the respect of the community, that kind of evidence creates powerful enemies. Complaints eventually reached the NHRA national office in significant enough volume and from significant enough sources that the organization felt compelled to act. 3 officials arrived unannounced at a regional event on one Saturday morning. After Carlton completed qualifying, they requested a full technical teardown of the Dodge Demon. He agreed without any hesitation and helped them through every step of the process himself, pulling components, labeling everything carefully, and answering every technical question the officials asked. He treated the inspection as an opportunity to demonstrate what he had built, not as a threat to be managed. They spent 4 hours going through that 426 Hemi. They checked displacement. They checked compression ratio. They examined the carburetor, the intake manifold, the cylinder heads, and the camshaft. They measured. They documented. They consulted with each other. And at the end of 4 hours, they packed up their instruments and wrote their report. The car was completely legal. Every measurement, every specification, every component entirely within the NHRA rulebook as it existed at that time. The only unusual language anywhere in that official inspection report was a vague phrase about certain port configurations potentially requiring review under what the report called updated classification guidelines. Carlton read that phrase once and understood immediately what it meant. It was not a technical finding. It was a warning. He began quietly documenting everything from that point forward, his complete build specifications, every inspection record, and every piece of written correspondence with the NHRA, because he recognized that a fight was coming, whether he wanted one or not. 6 weeks after that teardown, the NHRA published what appeared to be a routine technical bulletin. The first 2 pages were standard administrative updates, the kind of incremental clarifications and minor adjustments that the organization published regularly. But buried on page 3 of that bulletin was a new intake manifold and cylinder head specification, written in dense technical language that anyone with direct knowledge of Carlton's build recognized immediately as being written for one specific purpose. It was not a general safety standard responding to a widespread practice. It was not a clarification of an ambiguous existing rule. It was a specification written with precise enough technical detail to eliminate one particular configuration, the configuration that existed in Don Carlton's 1972 Dodge Demon, and essentially no other car in competition. Carlton called the NHRA office the same morning that bulletin arrived. He was told the new specification was effective immediately, no grandfather provisions for existing legal cars, no transition period, no advance notice to affected competitors. He went home and wrote a detailed 3-page technical appeal, citing the inspection results, his build documentation, and the specific language of the rules as they had existed when the car was built. The NHRA's response arrived in the mail several weeks later. It was a form letter, 1 page. No technical engagement with the arguments he had made. no scheduled hearing, no explanation of the reasoning behind the new specification. Just a final decision, stamped and signed, communicating that the matter was closed. $500,000. 2 years of the most careful and intelligent engine development work in the history of that pro stock class. 15 years of accumulated knowledge about the 426 Hemi that Carlton had built through years of patient, methodical work. Ended with a template response from an organization whose officials had stood in front of that engine 6 weeks earlier and found nothing wrong with it. The reaction across the pro stock community was mixed, but in the ways that mattered, it was deeply telling. Competitors who had been losing to the demon felt quiet relief. That was understandable. Nobody enjoys being beaten by a margin they cannot close, and the removal of a dominant competitor is always welcomed by the rest of the field at some level. But most of those same competitors, the honest ones, the veterans who had been racing long enough to recognize what had actually happened, were not comfortable with how the relief had arrived. They had not beaten Carlton on the track. They had not outdeveloped his engine or outdriven his car. The problem had simply been legislated away. And there is a meaningful difference in a sport that is supposed to be about who builds and drives the better machine between those two things. Veterans of the sport were far more direct in their assessments privately, and in some cases publicly. They called it what it was, a political decision. A move made to protect competitive balance in a form that would be acceptable to manufacturers and sponsors whose continued participation the NHRA depended on financially. A recognition that Carlton's level of performance was making the entire pro stock class uncomfortable for everyone, except the man who had built the fastest car. And an acknowledgement, implicit in the speed and finality of the bulletin, that the organization had known exactly what they were doing when they wrote that new specification on page 3. The trade magazines stayed completely silent on the matter. They depended on NHRA access, NHRA event credentials, and NHRA adjacent advertising revenue. No editor was willing to risk any of that for one band Mopar, regardless of how legitimate the story was. So the account that deserved to be told, the full documented story of a builder who had passed every inspection, who had followed every rule, who had invited scrutiny, and survived, it was never printed in any publication where it might have reached a significant audience. It survived only in conversations between the people who had been there. The timing crews who had run his numbers twice. The officials who had spent 4 hours finding nothing wrong. The competitors who had lost to him fair and square and knew it. After the ban, the Dodge Demon sat in storage for months while the appeal process ran its course and produced its form letter. Once finality arrived and Carlton accepted that no official reconsideration was coming, he began quietly exploring a sale, not expecting to recover anything close to what the car represented in terms of time, knowledge, and financial investment, but hoping to recover something. It took considerable time. Nobody in the active racing community wanted the complications that came with owning a band car, the legal classification, the documentation trail, the questions that would follow it to any track it appeared at. Eventually, the Demon changed hands, and after that, it disappeared from the record. Over the years, rumors circulated in the community about where it had ended up. Some said a private collector had it stored somewhere in the American Southeast, intact and largely original. Others said the 426 Hemi had been pulled apart and rebuilt into something unrecognizable, a way of using the knowledge Carlton had put into those components without the complications attached to the car itself. A few people who were active in the pro stock community through the 1970s and 1980s claimed to have seen it at one point or another sitting in a garage, still wearing the Mopar Missile livery, intact, but clearly not having turned a wheel in years. The truth is that nobody can say with certainty where that car is today, whether it still exists in the form Carlton built it, whether the engine he spent 4 months hand-porting still sits assembled somewhere, or whether it was eventually taken apart and scattered. That uncertainty, the fact that a car this historically significant, built by a man this technically capable, might have simply dissolved into private hands and forgotten storage, is its own kind of tragedy on top of the original one. This story is not simple. It does not resolve cleanly into a story about good people and bad people, and it would be dishonest to tell it that way. The NHRA built American drag racing into what it became. Their safety standards, developed and improved over decades, saved lives that would otherwise have been lost on strips across the country. Their competition structure gave ordinary working people mechanics and farmers and factory workers an extraordinary national platform that would not have existed without the organization. None of that disappears because of what happened to Don Carlton. None of it is erased by one technical bulletin buried on page 3. But organizations accumulate power over time. And as they accumulate power, their priorities gradually shift, often without any single moment where someone makes a conscious decision to change direction. The shift from serving the sport to protecting the institution is not usually dramatic. Small decisions, in the careful weighing of which interests matter more than others, in the quiet calculation of what a dominant competitor's continued success costs in terms of manufacturer, relationships, and sponsor comfort, and the competitive equilibrium that keeps the money flowing into the sport. Don Carlton did everything that the sport asked of him. He followed the rules as they were written. He built something exceptional through completely legitimate means, through years of patient, intelligent work that nobody else had done, because most people were not willing to put in the kind of time and thought it required. He welcomed every inspection and passed everyone. He was transparent when opacity would have been easier. And at the end of it, he was eliminated not because he had cheated, not because any official had ever found a single thing wrong with his car, but because his excellence had become inconvenient for the system around him. Every single person watching this has seen that dynamic somewhere in their own life, in their own workplace, their own community, their own competitive experience. The person who outperforms the system does not always get rewarded for it. Sometimes the system finds a way to manage them instead. Sometimes the form letter arrives, and the matter is officially closed, and the record is written in a way that leaves the full story out. That is the human story inside the racing story. And it is exactly why, after all of these years, it deserves to be told out loud, in full, without the sanitizing that the official record applied to it at the time. If you are watching this video and you have direct knowledge of where Don Carlton's 1972 Dodge Demon is today, I genuinely want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Because some stories deserve a proper ending, and this one has been waiting for one long enough. I will see you in the next one.